Welcome to Paranormal Palace Radio, where truth equals reality, and truth is often stranger than fiction.
Hello everyone, welcome to Paranormal Palace Radio. This is your host, Royce the Redneck Radio Man, and I've still got a bit of a frog in my throat, so I guess you're going to have to bear with me until the season clears up some, or I get a break somewhere, pardon me. Tonight, we're going to be talking to Nick Redfern, and he was a member that wrote a chapter in Lost Civilizations and Secrets of the Past, along with many other authors. This is a anthology, and a lot of material about ancient mysteries have been covered in this particular book, in fact, by different authors. Frank Joseph has a chapter about archaeological scandals. Oberon Zill has a chapter about Paradise Lost, Cosmology of the Afterlife, Hamlet's Mill and the Star-Strewn Path, and the End of Days by Adrian G. Gilbert, Atlantis and the Lost Valhalla by Philip Coppens, Temples, Creators, Gods, and Transfiguration of the Soul by Freddie Silva, Our Sonic Past, The Role of Sound and Resonance in Ancient Civilizations by Reed E. Jones and Larry Flaxman, Oppenheimer's Iron Thunderbolt, Evidence of Ancient Nuclear Weapons by Micah Hanks. And then, of course, our guest tonight, Nick Redfern, has a summary in there of his upcoming book, From the Pyramids to the Pentagon, the U.S. Government and Ancient Mysteries, which is going to probably be a must-read, especially since a few people know how much the government's interested in ancient artifacts. Race Interrupted, Ancient Aliens and Evolution of Humanity by Scott Allen Roberts, Clash of the Giants, The Untold Story of the Lost Atlantean Race by Pat Chenard, and I probably mispronounced it, The A.B. Intervention Hypothesis, The Truth Behind the Myths by Paul Bond Ward, so, in The Mimic and the Pigs, Distant Cousins by Steve Sora, UFO Cults and a Brief History of Religion by William Brumley, and A Symbolic Landscape by Mystery Nabla Playa, and Our Ancient Past by Thomas Brophy, and then The Time Machine by Rick Van Deniken. So as you folks can see, this is one book that covers many different topics under the main umbrella of ancient mysteries, and it's really a very fascinating book, and it puts a lot into a very small area, and Nick's going to talk to us a little bit about that tonight. And he's also recently had a book come out called Keep Out, where he talks about government installations around the entire world that, the rest of us civilians aren't supposed to be anywhere near there, and the things that people think are going on there. Now, before we get started too much further, real quick, before I forget, Nick's homepage is www.nickredfern.com. For those of you listening at YouTube or at iTunes or Shoutcast or somewhere else, you can always come join us in the chat room at www.paranormalpalace.com. And the call-in number is 632-832-7904. I look forward to people calling in. You can also IM me through Skype at Mr. Paranormal. So, Nick, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing good, thanks, Royce. Sorry to hear your voice isn't so good.
I know. I'm glad to hear yours is doing good, so at least I don't have to worry about somebody else there.
Yeah, that's right. You just quickly ask the questions, and I'll make the answers kind of long-winded.
Well, you know what? I think I crammed quite a bit into 4 minutes just now. But so Nick, this isn't the first time New Page Books has asked you to get involved in writing an anthology or doing a chapter, is it?
No, I've actually done a couple more for them. They did a UFO anthology and also a ghost anthology. And for the UFO one, I did a chapter on the so-called Kingman UFO crash, Kingman, Arizona. There's a long-standing story of an alleged UFO crash outside of Kingman in May 1953, and a lot of strands and intriguing aspects to this story. So I did that for the UFO one, and then for the ghostly one, I did a chapter on like spectral animals and ghostly animals and sort of life after death in the animal kingdom. And
we already talked about what you put in the Lost civilizations about the pyramids and the Pentagon. I noticed that that's already up at New Page Books. If you don't mind me jumping the gun a little bit, I'm curious, when does that due to hit the market?
That should be out some point in June, so about another 5 months thereabouts, I think.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, it shouldn't be too far away. They usually kind of put out a book from me about every 6 months or thereabouts, 6-7 months, and the last one, Keep Out, came out in December, and then this one will be June. So, yeah, pretty much 6 months between the two.
Well, if you don't mind me asking you, Nick, because the ancient alien theory is one of my favorite areas of study. I might have mentioned it to you in the past when you was on my show, which is always a pleasure to have you here. But do you have much of an interest in the ancient alien theory?
Yeah, I do. I mean, the whole area of sort of that I cover in this chapter in the new book from New Page, Expose, Uncovered and Declassified, the Lost Civilizations and Secrets of the Past. It's not a subject that I've sort of written about extensively or even to a small degree before, but it's a subject, that I've read a lot about. Right back to the days of people like Robert Giroux and, early Eric von Däniken and stuff, and, a lot of these early authors who delved into the mysteries of the past. And I think, a lot of people, I think we all kind of have, or I believe anyway, I think a lot of people have sort of a subconscious understanding or knowledge, even if we don't really know why, that sort of profound things happen in the past, in terms of our history that we don't really know about, but we have sort of almost like a buried cultural memory relating to things like, ancient civilizations and sort of fantastic civilizations and cataclysmic disasters and floods in the ancient past. It's almost like it's on the tip of all our tongues, but we can't quite get it. It's, like it's some sort of race-related, inherited memory, if you like, I think. And I think for that reason, that's why all this sort of stuff fascinates me, the idea that, in our ancient past, there were mysteries that have been lost to the fog of time, if you like, and that relate to, these things like the pyramids and ancient astronaut stories and things like that.
Well, I was reading on page 66 of your book, Keep Out, that Hitler was interested in the Holy Grail, and I was wondering, are there other holy relics that he had his sights on?
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting area, certainly in the world of fiction. This was sort of most famously portrayed in the first Indiana Jones film, Raiders of the Lost Ark, where Hitler and his cohorts are after the Ark of the Covenant. But, although the Raiders of the Lost Ark was just a work of fiction, in reality, the Nazis had a deep obsession and an interest in ancient artifacts. For example, not just Hitler himself, but a significant number of high-ranking Nazis, such as Rudolf Hess, Otto Rahn, and Heinrich Himmler, they had sort of major obsessions with the supernatural, mystical stuff, ancient artifacts, biblical artifacts, that sort of thing. For example, Otto Rahn, who sort of made his mark in a wing of Nazi Germany's SS, he spent a significant period of time trying to find the so-called Holy Grail, which, according to the Bible, was the dish, plate, or cup used by Jesus at the Last Supper, and supposedly it possessed the ability to, it had devastating powers, and of course, with that in mind, the Nazis were keen to get hold of it. That's just one particular example. Another one, Heinrich Himmler. He was one of the driving forces within the Nazi regime in terms of delving into the occult and trying to determine really if it was something that could be weaponized, from the perspective of trying to understand ancient artifacts and these superpowers they allegedly possessed, and then trying to turn them into a weapon that could be used against, the Allies during the war. And that's just two examples. We hear other stories about the so-called Spear of Destiny. Again, the story about the fabled spear or lance that supposedly pierced the body of Jesus during the crucifixion. Again, the story is that the Nazis were hot on the trail of that. But again, whether or not, we can vindicate the story or prove what happened to it, that's a different matter. But we can say for sure that all these different artifacts and things like this regardless of whether, they were real or they were just something carved out of legend thousands of years ago, the Nazis were hot on the trail of them.
Yeah, I think I'd read before that Hitler had an interest in that. Didn't he also have an interest in the, I think it's pronounced Aryan race?
Yeah. Hitler, basically, or a lot of the Nazis, I should say, not just Hitler, they took the view, that the Germans were, as they became infamously called themselves, the master race. And they sort of viewed their lineage, if you like, or some of them did. Actually, a number of high-ranking Nazis believed that the Aryan race, the German race, the sort of as they viewed it, the pure race, actually could trace its lineage back to the ancient Atlanteans. And again, many people within the Nazi Party and the high-up sources close to Hitler had a deep fascination with the story of Atlantis and spent a lot of time sort of delving into ancient records and manuscripts, trying to determine, where Atlantis was and what this lineage meant and how, they could sort of use the secrets and the powers of the Atlanteans to try and get a foothold and, eventually conquer the planet. A lot of people assume that the Second World War, from the Nazis' perspective, that it was all just about, fighting with tanks, guns, aircraft, etc., which, of course, to a great extent it was. But behind the scenes, there was this whole movement, if you like, to understand the ancient past, to weaponize it, to understand the occult, to sort of call forth paranormal and supernatural entities that, the Nazis wanted to sort of engage and work with in simplistic terms. Behind the scenes, it was a very weird war for the Germans. It was as much about magic and mysticism and ancient mysteries of the past almost as it was, with regular tanks, bullets, guns, etc.
A war on two fronts.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, in the chat room, pardon me, Jim was saying something about Hitler was also interested in the Hollow Earth theory. Do you know anything about that by any chance?
About what, sorry?
About Hitler and his interest in the Hollow Earth theory.
Oh, yeah, the Hollow Earth one, that was another one. I mean, a lot of these stories, they came from, some of the high-ranking people around Hitler, and that was one of the other areas as well, that the idea that there could be either a hollowed Earth or, some sort of areas of the planet with massive underground caverns and this sort of thing. And part of this actually tied in with some of these stories that the Nazis were pursuing about Atlantis, being either a sunken continent or something that sort of vanished into the earth, or its people went underground. That's actually something that's mentioned in a number of the old archives and letters of some of the people close to Hitler, the idea, that these Aryan master races, as the Nazis viewed them, survived Atlantis and may have seeded civilizations elsewhere on the planet, but also there may have been sort of like an underground aspect to their society as well.
Yeah, I've read something to that effect. I understand that a lot of the tortures that went on was also dealing with trying to find a way to make people where they could withstand the cold on the front, which that was
they did
pretty horrible stuff.
Yeah, sort of shocking experiments, and fortunately, they were defeated, or would have had a very different world today. Arguably, we'd be talking German by now, maybe. If we were still around, even.
Also, on page 135, you tell of Officer Valdez during his investigation finding an oily yellow substance in the area of the craft's tripod where it landed at the time, and it was not determined what that substance is. Can you tell me if there's a way to get your hands on a sample of that substance today?
Well, yeah, that one you're talking about, Royce, this relates to a chapter I have in the Keep Out book on the rumors and stories of the so-called underground alien base at Dulce, New Mexico, which is this small town in northern New Mexico, quite isolated, and where there are rumors of this sort of vast alien fortress, if you like, inside this place called the Archuleta Mesa in the town of Dulce. What's interesting about the story is that the whole area around Dulce has been a hotbed of weird activity for years, literally decades. And one of the prime things that's been reported all around the Dulce area for decades is cattle mutilations. Now, under the terms of the Freedom of Information Act, the FBI has released hundreds of pages, formally classified pages, from its files on these cattle mutes in and around the Dulce area. Now, this one that you're talking about, this actually relates to an official document from 1975 where a police officer named Gabe Valdez went out to the ranch of a man named Manuel Gomez, who had a number of animals killed under very weird circumstances. And the document that you're talking about actually talks about Valdez and the rancher and Valdez's deputy coming across this dead cow with organs removed, with significant amounts of blood missing, with weird tripod-like landing marks all around the cow, and also what's described in official FBI files as a yellowy-coloured, oily substance. And this was actually dispatched to a forensic lab, like a high-quality forensic lab of the New Mexico State Police, who could not identify whatever this was, the substance. On top of that, Dr. Howard Burgess, who was a scientist from the Sandia labs in New Mexico, came out to the scene and did a radiation count and found that there were significant radiation levels in the area where the cow was. Now, when you ask, can we access this? Unfortunately, we can't. I mean, this was, it was dispatched to the New Mexico State Police in 1975. It was 37 years ago, and unfortunately, it's sort of just been lost, vanished, destroyed, or whatever. We know it doesn't exist in, some archive at the police department anymore now, unfortunately.
So there's no way to actually tell if the original official report was doctored then?
No, I mean, we're sort of wholly reliant on the document, but I mean, Gabe Valdez was a very astute and credible person, and he actually, after he left the police, and he died just last year, but he went on record as saying that he felt there was a genuine cattle mutilation mystery, and very possibly some sort of installation underground in the Dulce area. So, he wasn't somebody who was hiding the facts. Now, whether anybody else was, that's a bigger question. But
actually, I was thinking maybe the lab was.
Yeah, well, I mean, Valdez was, an above-board person. He was an honorable person and told you as he saw it and felt there was a cover-up and conspiracy relating to the cattle mutilations. He was absolutely sure of that. And that's reflected in the FBI's files. But he also felt that he was being given the runaround by certain labs and places like this. When he was trying to get to the truth, he felt he was being stonewalled and, attempts were being made to slow down his investigations.
Alrighty. Now, real quick, Jim asked, the picture we find of Hitler and the alien, she wants to know, do you think it's a genuine picture? And I've never heard of this picture. I'm not sure if you have or not.
I haven't. I don't know what that is. A picture of Hitler with an alien, allegedly.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I haven't seen that at all, no.
I'm going to Google that later tonight or tomorrow. That sounds interesting. Okay. Now, you mentioned the Chupacabra in Puerto Rico on page 205. Now, I've heard quite a bit about them, and I was wondering if you'd mind telling the listeners, because some would know what it is and some don't, exactly what a Chupacabra is.
Well, yeah, I mean, I've been on a number of expeditions and investigations to Puerto Rico looking for the Chupacabra, and most people describe it as about the body being about the size of like a monkey or a chimpanzee. In other words, sort of quite slim, but, fairly muscular and large. Hairless, with large fangs and vicious-looking claws, these glowing red eyes, sometimes even sort of bat-like wings, sort of membrane-type wings rather than feathery wings. And also with what looks like a row of spikes extending from the top of its head to down its neck and partly down its back, kind of like a punk rock mohawk type of appearance. So it looks like it's a weird-looking creature. And it's called the Chupacabra because Chupacabra is Spanish for goat sucker. And the reason it was given that name is because when the reports of the Chupacabra kicked off big time in the early 1990s, a lot of the farm animals, where ranchers were talking about their animals being killed and drained of blood, a lot of the animals that were killed were goats. Puerto Rico actually doesn't have sort of any indigenous large animals, like big cats or anything like that. The biggest animals on the island are things like pigs and cows, many of which are imported originally anyway. The actual indigenous animals on the island are quite small, so there really shouldn't be anything like the Chupacabra, or even, a large predatorial animal like a big cat that could, be on the island and carrying out these attacks. So, that's what made it weird. Now, as I said, I've been on a number of expeditions to Puerto Rico in search of the Chupacabra, and the reason why I included a chapter on this in Keep Out is because there are a significant number of stories that link UFO activity and Chupacabra activity on the island with secret bases. One of the places that I talk about in this particular chapter is a place called Roosevelt Roads. And Roosevelt Roads is a former U.S. naval base stationed, I should say that the people were stationed at the base, but the base is on an area of Puerto Rico. It's actually closed down now. But what's interesting about Roosevelt Roads is that there's a persistent story which has actually been talked about by literally dozens of people from their own perspective who know something about this particular story as it relates to the Chupacabra. And the story is that at some point in the early 1990s, supposedly 3 or 4 highly vicious Chupacabra were caught alive rather than shot dead by what in simplistic terms, we might call like a Delta Force type squad, and were supposedly held in a secure vaulted area at Roosevelt Roads before being transferred to some sort of location in the U.S. Now, as I said, that's sort of it's a fascinating but sensational story at the same time. But what's intriguing is that on each occasion I've been to the island, I've heard this story, and, that the number of witnesses, not only is it a large number of witnesses, but they're people with very good calibers and backgrounds, including police officers, civil defense operatives, and veterinarians who were brought in by the civil defense people to examine animals reportedly killed by the Chupacabra. And they'd all heard these stories about weird stuff going on at Roosevelt Roads. And there's also a very strange series of stories about UFOs coming in and out of the oceans off of Puerto Rico late at night and in the early hours of the morning, which has sort of provoked stories and rumors of, like, not just an underground base, but possibly an undersea base, something buried deep below the seabed where some of these UFOs are coming and going from.
Okay. Now, I've talked to Norio Hayakawa about the going-ons at Dulce, and he indicated to me that it's really hard to tell what is going on there because you can't hardly get into anywhere or any place of any real note there. I was just wondering if you had any other reports from anybody else.
Well, yeah, I mean, the thing is, with the underground-based story at Dulce, we are reliant on people who've come forward, and unfortunately, for the most part, the majority of them haven't wanted to speak on the record. And, of course, this is what leads a number of researchers not to want to look into it or dismiss it because they feel it has no merit. But one of the other reasons why I think it does, and this is an important thing, is that we can prove and demonstrate that back in the 1960s, in 1967 specifically, the U.S. government had a project called Operation Gas Buggy. And the idea of Gas Buggy was to release small nuclear devices deep underground. And the point would be to sort of, blow a huge underground hole, which would prompt the release of natural gas, and then the natural gas could be collected and used as fuel. And a lot of people don't realize this, but it's actually a verifiable fact that you can look up on the internet at the Department of Energy's archives and find that in 1967, the Atomic Energy Commission actually released a fairly large kiloton nuclear device deep below an area of New Mexico called the Carson National Forest, which happens to be situated only 12 miles from Dulce. And this atomic device was actually a 29 kiloton yield nuclear device, and it was exploded 4,240 feet below the Carson National Forest, as I said, just 12 miles from Dulce. Now, even today, in that particular area, the government, and by definition the Atomic Energy Commission, actually has signs up warning people that they will be in violation of the law if they start digging in and around that particular area. So this is what I find intriguing. We have the story of an underground base at Dulce, and only a few miles away, we have warnings from the government telling people, do not dig underground in this area. Now, the official story is the government doesn't want people digging in the area and risk releasing, radiation from this test back in the 1960s. The other theory, which is sort of a far darker and disturbing one, is that the Dulce base is supposedly, under the control of hostile aliens, and that the atomic blast in the 60s was not an attempt to release natural gas, but was kind of like a panicked attempt by the government to try and destroy this alien installation. Now, again, people think, well, that sounds like something straight out of sci-fi.
Yeah.
But when we can prove that the government actually did explode an atomic device only 12 miles from Archuleta Mesa, where the Dulce base is said to be located, you have to wonder what really is going on. And I
what
think
would prompt them to detonate one so close?
Well, yeah, that's the big question. The theory is that they tried to destroy the alien base, or contaminate it with radiation. To what extent that's true, we don't know. But when you find, in the very area where the base is supposed to be, there was atomic detonations, cattle mutilations, all sorts of weird UFO activity, black helicopters. And I think it's actually the story will probably and hopefully gain a lot more publicity and possibly even more leads, because later this year, a movie about the Dulce base is coming out. It's going to be called Top Secret Umbra, and it's like a sci-fi movie based around the story of the Dulce base. So maybe, hopefully, that could bring, more people forward, whistleblowers and insiders who might know something about the truth of the story.
I know I'm going to want to see that movie. Matter of fact, I'm going to keep an eye out for that, because that sounds like it's going to be a pretty good movie. What I've heard tell and read is that they did find a shaft on the archipelago, or right there at the mesa, but they have no idea where it goes.
Yeah, there's a few stories like that where people have said they've seen what look like old shafts into the ground, or other people have found like military equipment, even like canteen ration containers, as if the military had been out there doing something. And periodically people still stumble across things like that. So, again, this is all sort of suggestive of something. The big question is what, and even I'll be the first to admit that in terms of where the truth ends and the rumors begin, it is sort of a blurry area still, which is precisely why, I think the important thing is that we keep digging, metaphorically and literally, to find out if the base really is there. So.
That kind of reminds me of an old saying of my dad about, watch this hen, see what that one does. It's almost like they're smoke screening with all these conspiracy theories to have your attention diverted away from what's really going on.
Well, that could be. I mean, it's like one of these things. If you can't hide the truth, you bury it in a mass of half-truths and lies, so people don't know what the truth is when they stumble on it, because your head just gets dizzy with so many different theories and, conflicting rumors, which I think a lot of this is done deliberately. If you try and just hide something, chances are when people stumble on it, they know it's the real thing because we haven't found it before. But when it's out in the public domain and there's 10 different, 15 different theories as to what happened, it's pretty much a good guarantee that a lot of those stories are purposefully spread to hide the truth of what's really going on.
In fact, didn't you mention that a possibility in your book, Keep Out, if I remember correctly? I saw that in there somewhere.
What, that general theory, you mean?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I think, you can look at that with UFOs, for example. It's like if people ask me, do I think there are real UFOs from somewhere else? Yes, I do. But I also think there are highly classified military craft that are being flown around that, are far in advance of anything that we know about, and that for all intents and purposes are UFOs. And I think government agencies, they blur the line to confuse the truth. about what lies at the heart of the UFO phenomenon. You know, they're keen to hide the fact that there's a genuine phenomenon from somewhere else. And equally, they're keen to hide the fact that they're flying some really weird-looking exotic aircraft. And at times, they spread rumors about both of these things, and they intertwine the stories. And so, again, we're never really sure, you know, where the line between the two ends. And again, I think that's the sort of thing that's being done deliberately, possibly out at Area 51. So we're not really sure, you know, what's going on there even.
Yeah, I think you got something there because, I mean, let's face it. I mean, it's not UFOs, it's ghosts. It's not that. It's ancient aliens or top secret bases. Everything you can find, all kinds of evidence, but no absolute proof. Almost as if it was that way by design.
Well, I think that's part of it as well. You know, one of the things that agencies are very good at is sort of giving us, you know, dangling the carrot, so to speak, and waiting for us to, like a, you know, fish, and then hooking the fish with the bait. And, you know, we're the fish, unfortunately, and the UFOs are the bait. And what happens is that often, you know, we go off looking for these things, and people can get tied up for years on certain investigations where I'm pretty much convinced, you know, somebody on the inside has deliberately and officially tried to siphon them away from something into a far safer area from the government's perspective. And so, you know, somebody who could be researching something really groundbreaking finds themselves obsessed with and tied up investigating something that at the end of the day isn't real. You know, but that works to the government's advantage, but not to the UFO research communities.
Right. And as a matter of fact, I think you mentioned a certain Walter Bosley of the CIA in your book that was talking about the same thing that we're discussing now. And it caught my attention because he's been on my show a couple of times with his book, Latitude 33, Key to the Kingdom. But
Walter has an interesting background. He was actually with the FBI and the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. And Walter's spoken out about how, you know, official stories were spread about UFOs to hide super secret classified Air Force programs. In other words, you know, if somebody inadvertently saw some weird looking futuristic test aircraft being flown, and there was a fear that, you know, somebody's going to tell the press and the media is going to start talking about it, the military then began sort of subtly spreading stories about UFOs and little green men in the area to deflect attention away from the military, because they knew that the press would, you know, be happy to talk about little green men and sensationalize all this, you know, and the military secrets would remain hidden behind like a UFO smokescreen.
Right. You know, when I talked to Walter, I got the distinct impression that he has little, if any, doubts that there's a possibility we're being visited from another planet. It's just that he wouldn't say that would be the cause of all of them.
No, I mean, this is an important thing. You know, Walter's spoken out, you know, quite openly on the idea of a genuine UFO phenomenon and something, you know, genuinely anomalous having occurred at Roswell. You know, so he's not, I want to stress that, he's not some sort of government spokesperson who's saying, you know, UFOs don't exist because the government happens to use the subject to hide its military.
In other words, he's not a disinfo agent.
No, he's actually pointing out as well that although the government hides things and creates fake UFO stories to hide its military activity, he's gone on record as stating that doesn't take away the fact that there appears to be a genuine UFO phenomenon as well. You know, it's like this, that's what makes it so complicated, that, you know, there are real UFOs and real UFO incidents, and then there are also fabricated UFO incidents created by the government to hide their activities and also to make the UFO subject look stupid.
It also makes it hard to tell how much involvement the government might have with extraterrestrials.
Yeah, and what we have at the end of the day then is sort of like a massive amount of material and data, and we're just not sure, you know, which is good data and what's bad data and what's somewhere in between, shall we say.
Yeah, that's true. I know I went through a bunch of it in books and on the internet, and it is really hard to tell, and you got to really get through the bias and the, you know, assumptions and all of that stuff. And even when you do that, you're still not sure.
No, you're right. You're not. I mean, all we can kind of do, you know, is what I always tell people is, you know, do your own investigation, study it, come to your own conclusions, look carefully at everything, filter everything. You know, it's like a lot of people, and I do, you know, we take a lot of value when military people come forward and tell us stories, you know, because they can be important. But one of the things a lot of people, in their excitement, forget to do is ask the question, why am I being approached with this story by someone from the military? You know, is it just an innocent case where the person wants to relate something they knew, or has the researcher got too close to something on another issue?
And are they using it as a bond?
Yeah, this is like, you know, he's sort of the bait to lure you away from the important stuff to an area that, you know, it doesn't really exist. And, you know, you're chasing your tail thanks to this new lead, and this really hot story that you should have been on, you know, falls by the wayside.
Well, that is true. I've seen it happen time and again. You know, I was going to mention also in Chapter 14, you talk about the mysteries of Montauk, also known as the Philadelphia experiment. And I was going to ask you, because you, above all people, seem to know where all this stuff is at better than a lot of other people, like you go looking around the world to look up stuff. Have you heard of any more cases that were in any way similar to the Philadelphia experiment?
Well, yeah, I mean, you know, the Philadelphia experiment, this sort of naval experiment from the Second World War, where supposedly the military was doing classified experiments on both radar invisibility and magnetic invisibility, and supposedly in the Philadelphia Naval Yard at some point in 1943, one of these experiments went wrong and resulted in literal optical invisibility, you know, kind of invisible man invisibility. And one of the other aspects to the story, supposedly the ship reportedly sort of vanished for a few moments, teleported in simplistic terms, and then returned again to its original place. And a lot of stories about the crew members, a lot of them going mad and being killed and dying in the experiments, and all sorts of weird stuff like this. And, you know, you ask if there's sort of any sort of similar parallels. Well, just a few years ago, the Air Force actually released a report that it had contracted out to a private company into one of these very fields, teleportation. And it was basically designed to try and determine if, you know, teleportation of the type that worked very well in Star Trek and that didn't work too well in The Fly, which could be a reality, you know. And so in other words, we know that the Air Force, and as this document states, it talks about the government and the Department of Defense having done a number of studies over the years into teleportation. So again, as science fiction-like as teleportation sounds, we can demonstrate now officially through the Freedom of Information Act that some of the stuff that was reputedly done in the war at Philadelphia is still being researched. Now, we also know that the government has done extensive research, particularly in recent years, into the field of invisibility and trying to create technologies that will bend light. You know, in other words, to distort tanks on the battlefield. And
I saw articles on that in Google News a couple of years ago.
Yeah, I mean, this is all sort of very interesting fringe research, but it's being done. So in other words, although this sort of 60-year-old experiment, or nearly 70-year-old experiment now, again sounds sci-fi-like, we know the government has been researching these very areas. And people say, well, why is it then, you know, if the Philadelphia experiment was 1943, why is it we are still kind of looking into it now? Why haven't we sort of really tapped into it and managed to perfect it? And I think there's probably two reasons. One is that, you know, the science may be just so advanced that, you know, it still eludes us. One of the other stories is that when the Philadelphia experiment occurred, you know, nobody was actually, despite what some people have said, the main story is that nobody was actually trying to make the ship optically invisible. The whole plan was radar invisibility and magnetic invisibility, but something went wrong and it was rendered literally invisible. And the story is that the scientists were so sort of panicked and didn't know what they were dealing with and were fearful of sort of treading in uncharted waters that the program was hastily shut down. And because the atomic bomb was seen as being a success, and, you know, that this was during the war, somebody said, well, you know, we've got the atomic bomb, we'll focus on that, that's going to end the war, and we'll come back to this in later years. Right now, we've got to fight for our survival. So in other words, the idea is that lots of weird plans and projects and experiments were put into place, and whichever one worked, and as it turned out it was the atomic bomb, that was the one they went with. And they just put everything else on hold until later years when they could understand the technology more. And that might explain why there was sort of a long gap between the initial test in 43 and what might have come, 15, 20 years later when somebody went back and said, hey, let's take another look at this again.
Yeah, because, it's like the one recently, it was done by bending light, manipulating light,
Yeah.
whereas back then, it was a whole big magnetic field that, for all we know,
That's right.
could have actually displaced time and space around the Eldridge.
Yeah, that's the basic story. A lot of today's research into invisibility isn't sort of literal invisibility, that you see in the movies and in, TV shows and movies like The Invisible Man. A lot of it is sort of bending light to warp, what the person sees. And also, one of the interesting things that the Air Force is working on is making their aircraft what they call chameleon-like. That's to say, the metal on the aircraft, the wings, the fuselage, etc. If they're flying under, say, blue skies, the military's actually working on a particular, like a formula of a coating that will actually turn blue, and when it's in a blue sky. And if the sky turns grey, the coating turns grey. In other words, it's sort of the aircraft literally blends in with the background, and it isn't invisibility, but it really does cut down the ability of people to see the craft visually. And of course, if it possesses stealth properties, then it's not trackable on radar either. So for all intents and purposes, you do have a near invisible aircraft.
And you could go drop a nuke anywhere you want and not get blamed for it.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a dastardly plan.
Yeah, it is.
Well, now on page 218, you also talked about mind monsters, and you tell about a man named Duncan Cameron, who, as I understand it from reading it, he actually manifested a Bigfoot creature from his mind, or what appeared to be one, or something to this effect.
Yeah, this ties in with a Tibetan phenomenon known as tulpas, which is Tulpas. If you Google that, you'll find massive amounts of material, and probably quite a bit that I've written about it on the subject as well.
That's what I was going to ask you, because you wrote about it in Men in Black, and I remembered it.
Yeah. Well, tulpas, basically, the idea is that the human mind, if you focus on a particular image, you can kind of externalize that image into reality and give it sort of some semblance of life. In other words, if you focus, as this guy Duncan Cameron allegedly did at Montauk, let's say you focused on the image of like a large 7-foot-tall, massive, hairy, Bigfoot-type creature with glowing red eyes, and you focus on this and you learn how to get yourself in kind of like a trance meditation state, and you visualize this creature in your mind over days and then weeks and possibly even months, then eventually people start to see it in like shadowy form, and then it takes on more semblance of reality, to where you're not giving birth to like a living creature, but you're bringing from the depths of your mind a creature that has like a semblance of reality, that can sort of has a quasi-existence outside of the creator, and even has some degree of self-awareness. And supposedly they thrive and survive on human emotion. In other words, they're like an emotional vampire. They bleed dry human emotion and high states of emotion. And Duncan Cameron, supposedly manifested one of these creatures, and it took supposedly a long time to reabsorb it after it started to run rampant. Now, again, that sounds bizarre, but none other than Gabe Valdez, who was the police officer involved in the New Mexico State Police Department's cattle mutilation files. I met with Valdez in 2010, and when I interviewed him, he openly told me that he'd heard stories in and around the Dulce area of the governments actually creating these sort of hologram-type Bigfoots, and in the vicinity of classified installations, and the specific reason being to scare off frightened and superstitious locals by, manifesting these monstrous forms that weren't real, but, they were sort of a directed hologram, which ties in very well with this story of, Montauk, and the fact that it comes from Gabe Valdez, who was consulted by the FBI and a high-ranking official within the New Mexico State Police. Again, this adds credence to this aspect of the Montauk story as well.
So, definitely it is possible to actually do this, but not everybody knows how, or not everybody has the kind of focus to do it.
I would say it's more, I wouldn't say everybody doesn't have the ability. I would say it's a matter of understanding and learning how to do it. It's like riding a bike. Not everybody can ride a bike, but pretty much everybody can be taught to ride a bike. I think it's like that. If you understand the ways and means behind it, then a lot of people, possibly everybody, might have the ability to do it, but it takes a lot of dedication, time, and also a lot of people who can do it really well. Supposedly, you have to enter into like an altered trance state. You have to learn how to get your mind focused off everything else and just in almost like a subconscious type state of mind, if you like, to sort of will this thing out of the depths of your mind, into reality.
I might want to practice on that. Just, it sounds like a lot of fun.
Yeah.
But
well, that's the thing. But some people say, because they supposedly feed on high states of emotion, they become sort of like cruel and evil, because the whole thing is they have to, by feeding on emotion, they don't want just your average, just normal everyday emotion. They need high states of emotion. So in other words, they typically become evil to provoke states of fear in people, and then they bleed dry that fear. So it's not necessarily the best thing to do, because you're faced with a sort of a crazed creature that, whenever possible, will put people into states of hysteria to then sort of bleed them dry of it.
I've had a man named Bob Curran on that had a book out about golems and monsters that he kind of indicated the same thing you're talking about.
Yeah, I think, I actually do believe, some people roll their eyes when I talk to them about tulpas, because I think I'm just into sort of nuts and bolts stuff. I'm not. I think there is a deep mystery here that, that the human mind has capabilities we don't necessarily understand, and one of them does relate to these sort of mind monsters, the idea that our subconscious has the ability to create what we see in reality, and sometimes maybe even we don't know we're doing it. People are fascinated by, the idea that there are monsters in the woods. It would be ironic if, that fascination is so deep and strong that collectively we then create them. We're responsible in some ways for them being there in the first place.
Before I forget, I want to mention once again, his website is www.nickredfern.com. And you also have a blog out, don't you, Nick, that you keep up to date?
Yeah, people, the best way, actually, the main website's being sort of worked on right now, but if people want to contact me direct, they can at nickredfernsbooks.blogspot.com, nickredfernsbooks.blogspot.com, and as I said, they can contact me there and learn more about what I'm doing, etc.
And what we're talking about tonight is his chapter in Lost Civilizations, as well as his book, Keep Out, where he's done a lot of the footwork for us that we don't have to go out and actually cover ourselves, since very few people know how.
Well, it doesn't hurt if you want to, though.
Now, getting back to the topic at hand, but also don't forget, folks, the address of this website, for those not listening here, is www.paranormalpalace.com, and the call-in number is 832-632-7904 if you want to ask a question. And getting back to the topic at hand, I'm sure everybody has heard about HAARP by now, and you write about it in Keep Out. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if, in your opinion, do you think HAARP might account for some EM field activity credited to ghosts?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting possibility. I mean, I hadn't actually given, that much thought to that particular scenario, right? A lot of the people in the HAARP research community, talk about weather modification, and some people have even tied it in with the weird spate of animal and bird deaths that occurred over Christmas, last year, 12, 13 months ago. But, when it comes to ghosts and things like this, I mean, there is, a lot of evidence, I think, that some of these things appear to be not necessarily the spirits of the dead, but they seem more to be like some sort of, almost like a tape playing over and over again, like on a loop, as if they are some sort of energy, if you like, whether, they once were living entities or not. I think that's open to debate, and I think, you could also make the argument there could be several different categories of ghosts, literally the dead returned, but I think some of these things as well, particularly where we have things like, electromagnetic disturbances, we could be looking at some sort of pure energy, and energy can be manipulated, so I think we couldn't rule out that scenario. It's an interesting one, definitely.
Yeah, I think it is too. I don't know who all might have thought about it before me, but it kind of got my attention. I was also going to say that we had a question in the chat room. Jen was wanting to know what your take was on Al Bielek, B-E-I.
Yeah.
It is, right?
Yeah, well, Al Bielek had, one of the most controversial stories about the Philadelphia experiment. And, what I say to people is that the more controversial, the more we need proof. And his story, he died not long ago, his story was, frankly, I found it unbelievable. I find it unbelievable in the sense that I found it unbelievable, and also in the sense that it was sensational. He talked about literally being one of the sailors and coming back from the future to the past and vice versa. And, I can't prove it's not true. But, when you're going to make those sort of claims that you were from the 1940s, etc., and you kind of came forward and backwards, etc., and the sort of time manipulation, the onus, I think, is on people making those claims to back them up. With that sort of stuff, we need to go beyond just witness testimony. We need something far more. Otherwise, it just has to remain in that grey basket until we can one day say yes or no. I don't think we should be proclaiming this as literal facts when, it's just one man's words, or it was one man's words.
I see a lot of people that make that mistake.
Yeah, and it doesn't mean we should ignore it, and it doesn't mean we should write it off. It means we should understand it for what it was. It was one man's words that so far we haven't been able to verify, and by all means investigate it, but have an understanding that that is what it is. It's not proof. It was one man's statement.
Also, can you tell us who would be a good author or person to go to learn more about Montauk?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of books on the internet. On places like Amazon, where you can find out more about the Montauk story. I think I'm not sure what the present count is, so to speak, but there's, for example, there's a whole range of websites, and there's Peter Moon's and Preston Nichols' book, The Montauk Project, which came out in 1992. Peter Moon's and Preston Nichols' books, they're sort of a good place to start. Also, if you want to go back further, and because the Montauk thing was supposedly an outgrowth of the Philadelphia experiment, there's the Charles Berlitz, Bill Moore book, The Philadelphia Experiment. Also, Morris Jessup's work back in the 50s sort of touched upon some of those things as well. And also a book that's harder to find now called The Jessup Dimension, written by a woman named Anne Genslinger. And that book delves deeply into the Philadelphia experiment and contains a lot of fascinating material. So, there's plenty of strands and leads out there. And arguably, I'd say there's almost like a saturation of data to where, you can really find yourself with your head spinning because, there's an overabundance of material almost on Montauk.
Okay. Now, I show we got 6 minutes remaining, so I was going to ask you if you want to share with anybody any upcoming events or any last-minute thoughts you might have.
Well, yeah, I mean, I live in the Dallas area, Dallas, Texas, and for people who, if there's anybody listening who's in that area, I'm actually giving a lecture this Sunday on the Keep Out book for a group called Epic, which is based in the Dallas area. So it's run by a man named Ken Cherry. So if you Google Epic plus Ken Cherry, you'll find all the details and the information of the lecture, and that's this Sunday. And I'll also be doing a lecture next month for the Dallas-Fort Worth MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network group, on the Real Men in Black book and the Keep Out book. That'd be sort of like a two-way lecture. And then I've got in June the next book, Pyramids in the Pentagon, which is like a full-length version of the chapter that appears in the Lost Civilizations book, and it deals with government investigations into everything from Noah's Ark, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Ark of the Covenant, Atlantis, Edgar Cayce, all sorts of people and places and events and artifacts, linked with the mysteries of the ancient past.
And it's not just our government; it's probably all kinds of governments throughout time have had an interest.
I've got America, Britain, Russia, and then the Germans during the Second World War, and a few other nations as well. So, it covers sort of a broad spectrum of countries that were sort of looking into, these issues of mysteries of archaeology and things like that.
Also, Jim was asking, what do you think about the EM weapons, the science, I think she says, or the science attacks?
In relation to what, sorry? Science? What did you say then?
What she put in the chat room, I'm having trouble understanding, was her exact words were, what do you think about the EM weapons, the silence attack?
A silent attack, did you say?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, well, EM weapons, electromagnetic weapons, there's absolutely no doubt they're a reality. These are the sort of things that can, that sort of nightmarish weapons that can, if directed properly and used properly, they can sort of just disable troops without even firing a bullet. They can provoke nausea, dizziness, vertigo, faintness, outright, unconsciousness by upsetting and disabling the nervous system, or just, sort of reconfiguring it in simplistic terms. There are other similar technologies that can provoke and create depression, anxiety, and the government's even working on programs to sort of beam messages into people's heads. You would imagine if you start to hear that, you're going crazy. And, maybe that's the idea, to send people crazy, in certain circumstances. So in other words, there's a whole range of very weird weaponry being developed that has nothing to do with bullets, guns, missiles, rockets, but everything to do with affecting the human nervous system, physical capabilities, mental capabilities, and what's frightening is that it isn't necessarily, just something that can be used on the battlefield. It can be targeted individually, so it's something to be aware of.
I would say so. Mm-hmm. And one last question from the chat room. She was asking if you're ever going to come to Canada, Montreal.
Would I ever come to Montreal?
Do you have any plans to, in other words?
I don't have any plans to. It's not one of these situations where I'm, like a millionaire or anywhere even close where I can, just sort of jump on a plane, investigate things. But I'm always, if anybody's doing lectures and conferences in different cities or countries, I'm always happy to speak at, those events. It's just, with the best will in the world, it's like most of us, I'm sure, in this sort of field, unless you win the lottery, we're kind of limited in, what we can do in terms of traveling, etc. But yeah, I've been to Canada before. I like Canada. I went gave a lecture a couple of years ago in Halifax, Nova Scotia, which was a cool place. I enjoy going there. And so yeah, if anybody listening ever wants to book me, I'll be happy to go up there. So.
Okay. Well, it's coming up close to the hour now. So I was going to thank you again for coming on my show. It's been a pleasure having you, just like it's always a pleasure. You're a fantastic speaker. You're well-versed. You know what you're talking about. And, I say when you come to Nick, you come for the straight dope. And I want to thank everybody else.
I shall quote you on that.
Do what?
I shall quote you on that. Come to Nick for the straight dope.
All right. I'll be happy to repeat it. But, I want to thank everybody else for listening in and taking part in the show, asking questions in chat. And remind y'all to come back Tuesday. This whole month is dedicated to ancient mysteries. And I failed to open up my deal to see who's coming on this coming up Saturday. But I want to say it's well, I forgot his name. It's Joseph. Well, I don't know what went wrong with me, Nick. I just got tongue-tied there at the last minute.
Well, we know it's Joe.
Oh, I'm thinking of Frank Joseph.
Oh.
But that's the 24th. And actually, Oberon Zell is going to be my guest this Saturday. And he's a reschedule from the first of the month when my system went down. So if y'all are waiting for him, make sure to tune in. Nick, I'm going to be in touch with you, and I'm going to look forward to having you come back and talk about your book about the pyramids, the Pentagon, and, the secrets of ancient mysteries.
All right. Well, thanks again, Royce, and I'll make sure they send you a copy of that book when it comes out.
Okay. Thanks, Nick. I appreciate it. You have a good night.
You too, Royce. See you later.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.